among you here will forget the exploits of Congo's Mobutu Sese Seko, who at one time was richer than his country, courtesy of his kleptocratic regime? Who among you here will forget the madness of Jean Bedel Bokassa, who crowned himself an emperor? Who among you here can afford the luxury of forgetting such individuals? Who among you will forget the activities of Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia? Who among you can afford that luxury? Who among you here can afford to forget the activities of Hissène Habré in Chad? African leaders were engaged in the kind of politics that was destructive of the continent. You will remember in 1957, when Ghana attained her political independence, Kwame Nkrumah was as clear as he was passionate. The independence of Ghana was but a beginning of the independence of Africa. In those early days, the bulk of Africa was under colonial rule, save for Ethiopia and Liberia. And it was very clear to him that Ghana's attainment of independence was but a beginning of a process that would take great effort. On that day, he recognized that the very first task that Africans had to grapple with was to regain their independence. His words have often been rendered in much more memorable form, not in the words that he himself spoke, but it has been said of him that he said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall be given unto you." And indeed, Ghana did seek and obtain the political kingdom. And when he stood in Accra, Ghana, he not only recognized that Ghanaians had been free, but he recognized that the project of liberating Africa was just beginning. He recognized then that going forward it would not be an easy task. He recognized at that time that the Portuguese were alive and well in Africa, controlling Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde. And he was conscious that his compatriots were fighting to liberate their countries. He therefore reminded those who were present on that day in Accra that going forward, that battle had to be finished. He recognized that the French were alive and well. They were present in Senegal. They were present in Guinea. They were present in Mali, Mauritania, Togo, Niger, Gabon, and many other areas. And he recognized that the French had to be removed and that Africans had to regain their independence. He recognized that the British were present in many African countries. They had been present in Ghana. They were present in the Gambia, in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Rhodesia then, and that they had to be removed. He was also alive to the fact that South Africa and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, was under the yoke of apartheid South Africa. Even in those early days, Kwame Nkrumah was so clear that the process of regaining African independence was also a process of exorcising the ghosts of disunity in Africa. And that is why in his mind, it was important that independence did not just mean the attainment of a new flag and a new national anthem. It meant much more. 1 year after Ghana attained independence, on the 15th day of April 1958 to be exact, there was a meeting of the then 8 independent African countries, at which he reminded those who were present that going forward it was important that Africa recognize the need for total liberation of Africa. Even in those early days, Kwame Nkrumah was under no illusion. He was under no illusion that the imperialist project was alive and well. And he exhorted those who were present in that assembly in Casablanca in Morocco that if Africa was to preserve her newly acquired independence, Africa had to look at the world differently. You will remember jointly with me that those were the years of the Cold War. Those were the years when the world was divided between the East and the West. And that gave meaning to Kwame Nkrumah's exhortation of the leaders then. Thou shalt look neither east nor west, thou shalt look forward. He exhorted African leaders on that day. Once again, in those very early years, he was clear that our politics had to be a politics of total liberation. And it has never been lost on me that even in those early years, there was no shortage of effort on the part of Kwame Nkrumah to bring unity and political vision to Africa. You will remember, even when there were only very few countries, he was present in Conakry in Guinea. He was present with Ahmed Sékou Touré then. He was in Mali with Modibo Keïta. He was with Patrice Emery Lumumba in the Congo to forge a united Africa. But this was never going to be easy. And as if Kwame Nkrumah was a prophet of sorts, no sooner had African countries started attaining political independence than the intrigues of the erstwhile colonial masters started rearing their ugly heads. It started so very early in 1960 in your very neighborhood here in Togo. The same year that Togo regained her independence from her colonizers in France is the very same year that their leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was removed from power. And if one went a little to the east, only 210 days after Congo had attained her independence, Patrice Emery Lumumba was not only removed from power, but was also assassinated. In other words, the sun was setting at noon. And Kwame Nkrumah's fears were coming true. And that is why he moved with jet-like speed to begin to tell African leaders of the day that something had to be done. Because you will remember in the 1960s, that was the period when most countries started attaining their political independence. In 1960s, we had the Nigerians regain their independence. The Senegalese regained their independence, as did the Côte d'Ivoirians. Central African Republic, Kenya, Uganda, and many other leaders and countries regained their independence. so that when the leaders met in the month of May in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, Kwame Nkrumah was already very clear that the only way in which Africans could immunize themselves from the shenanigans of the erstwhile political masters was to unite. Those of you who are alive then, and those of you who have been made alive courtesy of history will remember the words of Kwame Nkrumah in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. What amazes me at that time was the clarity with which he saw the issues of the day. What amazes me was the passion with which he identified the problems and the exactness with which he identified the issues which have continued to bedevil Africa today. Many leaders spoke on that day before Kwame Nkrumah spoke. The first leader to speak was, of course, the host of the African leaders, Ethiopia's Haile Selassie. And as if all of them had read Kwame Nkrumah's mind, Haile Selassie was clear in telling the 32 African leaders who are present on that day, not in so many words, but in effect he told them, we Africans have to unite and have to forge our own political agenda in order to ensure that our peoples are not only united, but we have the kind of politics that will give us a pride of place amongst the community of nations in the world. And Haile Selassie set the tone. 32 African leaders spoke, and each one of them was clear that the area which we had to focus on was in the arena of politics and the kind of politics that we had to engage in order to ensure that the continent was a continent that was free indeed. I remember only a few of those speeches. I remember that even those who later became hyenas as they grew into leadership were so clear in those early days that their voices were at once Solomonic and angelic. I remember the words of the then leader of Central African Republic, David Dacko. He said, we are assembled here today as Africans. My little country called the Central African Republic, what would it be without unity? If the colonizers wanted to take it, they would take it away. And the only way in which we can ensure that it's not taken away is through having a political union in Africa. Even David Dacko was clear in those early days. And as if there was a competition for clarity, Ahmadou Ahidjo of Cameroon was equally clear. He said, and I quote, I'm happy to be present with you here today. We come here to identify what is our common interest. And I have no doubt in my mind that Africa will only grow if our politics is the kind of politics that will help improving the quality of the lives of our people. But that clarity was not only restricted to Central and West Africa. Even in East Africa, there was clarity of thought. And that clarity was to be found in the words of Tanzania's first Prime Minister and President, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And he said, we come here not to find ourselves. We come here to find a common denominator. And that common denominator is the unity of the African peoples on the basis of the kind of politics that will lead this continent into the right direction. That clarity was amazing. But the man who captured the moment was the Osajefo, Kwame Nkrumah. There was a sense in which, when I read and reread Kwame Nkrumah's speech, I am amazed at how far he could see. I am amazed at how clear he was in his vision. There is not a single sector of the African economy, of the African society, or African politics that he did not look at. But in the arena of politics, he was clear in 1963. What amazes me was the sense of urgency on that day. He told the leaders, we must not come out of this arena without unity. He told them that if we do not unite today, I can tell you that the imperialists are not resting. He told them that today we must leave this hall in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with the United States of Africa. Because if we do not, Africa will not survive the intrigues of the erstwhile imperialists. He reminded the audience that the colonial project and the neo-colonial project was alive and well. He told them that there was a need for unity on that day. He reminded the 32 leaders who were present that they had not gone there for a jamboree, but they had gone there to create an Africa and a united Africa. And he told them, we must unite now, because if we do not unite now, each one of us will get used to our sovereignty and the trappings of power. He told them all of that. As if Kwame Nkrumah had the foresight of a Jewish prophet, all those things have come to pass. Of course, the Organization of African Unity was the product of reluctant leaders who could not see what Kwame was seeing sitting, even when they were standing on 10-foot poles. And there is a sense, therefore, in which one talks about African unity and political reawakening today is because we come from that very clear and rich history. And we ask ourselves what it is that happened, where is it that the rain started beating us? You know, why is this history necessary? Because at that time, Ghana was able, the leaders of the day were able to demonize Kwame Nkrumah. His legacy was almost obliterated. The statues that had been erected in his honor were brought down. So true that a prophet has no honor in his own home. But in 1972, he was taken upstairs. And when the Ghanaians and Africans started reading some of his works, they were able to realize that a great man had lived in their land. Kwame Nkrumah's memory was restored, and lo and behold, we celebrate a great Ghanaian, a great African. Of course, the coup in Ghana was in 1966, but there had been an earlier coup, as I said, in Togo in 1960, and an even earlier confusion in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1961. But then thereafter, Africa started to move in a totally different direction. My own countryman, the renowned novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, writes in an article, The Politics of Self-Reliance, he says that it would appear that when Africans raised a new flag, the leaders of the day were mentally lynched. They had ears, but they could not hear. They had eyes, but they could not see. And there is a sense in which Ngugi was right, because then coup d'etats started taking place in Africa. In Nigeria, they took away Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and the southerner of Sokoto. And there is a sense in which Nigeria has never been the same again. There is a sense in which Nigeria has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They went to Algeria and they took away Ahmed Ben Bella. And there is a sense in which Algeria has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They came down to Mali and they took away Modibo Keita, and there is a sense in which Mali has never been the same again. They went to Mauritania and they took others, and much more prominently they took away Mokhtar al-Dada. And Mauritania has never been the same again. They did not stop there. They were not in the business of stopping. They went to Central African Republic. They took away David Dacko. They went to Cameroon. They took away Hamadou Ahidjo. They tried to take away Sékou Touré. They failed. But they did not stop there. They went into every country. They went to Congo. They went to Uganda. They went everywhere. And they took away leaders so that Africa was, in a manner of speaking, a pawn in the political chessboard of the erstwhile colonizers. In fact, coup d'etats became so frequent in Africa that those who did not love Africa were hard to say that coups were as frequent as breakfast in Africa. What they did not know was that even breakfast was no longer frequent on African tables. Because Africans were no longer engaged in agriculture. Africa was no longer engaged in any meaningful production. All these while the Organization of African Unity, which had been created in 1963 as our savior, was not doing much. African Union, Organization of African Unity, became an annual jamboree of dictators at which they discussed very little. African politics had changed. When the coups left us, it did not stop there. The degeneration of African politics continued apace. Leaders who were surrogates of the colonizers dotted the African continent. And Africa became infamous for leaders whose greatest claim to fame was that they exploited their people and destroyed their countries. And African peoples were no longer enjoying their independence. Nkrumah had been clear in his mind that we seek first the political kingdom and the rest will be given unto us. But it would appear that the African leaders had it differently. Seek ye first the political kingdom and poison the political kingdom they must have had. So they poisoned the political kingdom and denied the African population the opportunity of enjoying the economic dividends of independence. They denied the Africans the opportunity of enjoying the dividends of unity. And Africa became not only the land of coups, but also the land of guerrilla fighters. Because these guerrilla fighters now emerged from the bush because Africa had to be liberated one way or the other. We had many of them. In Ethiopia, we had a guerrilla movement that brought up Meles Zenawi. And to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to Ethiopia. In Rwanda, after the genocide in 1994, we had Paul Kagame, and to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to that country. There was the emergence of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in Uganda, and to his credit, he restored some sobriety and normalcy to that country. We had another one in Liberia, but to his lack of credit, he destroyed that country, Charles Taylor. So that what happened is that African politics was confused. And I want to submit to you that African politics was not only confused, but it had been captured by individuals who had no interest in the safety and long-term health of the continent. So there was a time, because there was never ever a shortage of African leaders who meant well. They meant well, but there was always the hand of the erstwhile colonizer whose agenda was to demonstrate that Africans could not lead themselves. But even in those dark moments, there were great African leaders whose clarity of mind and clarity of vision was always the saving grace. It is not that they did not make mistakes. They made many mistakes, but they were honest mistakes. Who can forget Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere at that time? Who can forget at that time Zambia's Kenneth David Kaunda? Who can forget them? Who can forget at that time Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal? Who can forget at that time Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny? Who can forget that there were leaders who may have been making mistakes, including the introduction of one-party states as a possible antidote to the African problem, but they meant well. But the body of Africa was cancerous. And no amount of political chemotherapy was going to cure this cancer. The cancer had spread too deep. And that is why, therefore, today, I have said that there is need for the reawakening of African politics. Because what is happening in Africa today, perhaps if we took a mental survey of Africa, you will be able to agree with me that this particular argument is both timely and legitimate. Afford me a little luxury, if only to run across Africa, to identify for ourselves what is wrong with Africa today, and why our politics need to enjoy some newly introduced political hygiene. Look at Africa today. Look at Gabon. They have just been through an election, and they do not agree as to who has won and who has lost. In Africa, everybody wins the election. Look at Gabon. I want you to look at Zambia. They do not know who has lost and who has won. In Africa, nobody loses an election. The Zambians are not at ease. And you can go to many countries. You can go to Uganda in the recent past, Kenya in the recent past. We as Africans have a problem. You know, I was telling a friend of mine that Africa has a problem with counting votes. In other parts of the world, they can have voters in 50 million, in hundreds of millions, but in Africa, our voters never get past 10 million. But for some reason, when we are called upon to count our votes, we never can't count the votes. This is an African disease, the inability to count votes. And in my view and in my submission, that inability and that inadequacy of Africa to count the votes is one of the problems why Africa must reorient and must reawaken in our politics. It is not. When you look at Africa today, and sometimes we don't talk about it as openly and as passionately and as painfully as we should speak about it, because we do not know and appreciate that Africa remains, in the words of a Westerner who said that Africa remains a scar on the conscience of humanity. We may think that that is not politically correct, but it is the truth as I speak to you. Today, if we continue with our survey of Africa, we'll have occasion during the other lectures to talk about the economy and unity, but let us focus on the politics of it. Look at Mozambique today. Attained our independence from the Portuguese. As I speak to you now, it is not to be found in the headlines of many African newspapers, but there is a contestation in Mozambique between Frelimo and Renamo. The country is not at ease, yet they held an election. As I speak to you today, the Zambians are not at ease. They may have sworn their president on Tuesday of last week, but the opposition are now taking the matter, as they say, to the United Nations. We are exporting our problems. Africa cannot solve our problems. If you look at Angola, they are in a state that the Portuguese describe as "non guerra, non paz," no war and no peace. It is deceptive calm. You look at Equatorial Guinea, their politics is the kind of politics that does not allow people to express themselves. And as if Equatorial Guinea was not enough, you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the richest resource country in the world, yet one of the poorest countries in the world. They cannot hold an election. They say they have no money. You go to Burundi, it is the same thing. You go to Eritrea, Eritrea is not at ease. You go to Somalia, it is not at ease. You go to Central African Republic, you go to Burkina Faso, they expelled their president a few months ago. You go to Niger, go to Mali, they are killing one another as recently as yesterday. Go to Mauritania, go to Sierra Leone, they are not at ease. Go to the Gambia. There is a sense in which Africa needs to conduct her affairs differently. Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia is right. Africa is not poor. Africa is merely poorly managed.